Okay, yesterday we were talking about miracles and how people are opposed to the idea of miracles, what kind of opposition would be unreasonable or reasonable, and how to meet it. Today I want to talk about three or four footnotes on that discussion, depending upon how time goes. One is that true, maybe committing oneself to the laws of nature is dangerous because what science thinks are the laws of nature today is very likely to change. And we don't know what it'll look like when it gets finished changing, if it ever gets finished changing, so that doesn't give you any concrete basis to oppose miracles. I suppose someone says, okay, the laws of nature and covering all the phenomena of our world, that's definitely a big recipe, and we agree that to use what we don't have to critique miracles is not going to be a reasonable critique. But every educated, scientifically literate person believes that the world is material, it's physical. And if the world is physical and operates according to mechanical laws, even if we don't know exactly what the laws are, then there's no place for miracles. So it's materialism, commitment to the world being material or only physical, which would rule out miracles. Now there's an argument against this idea parallel to the argument we made about the laws of nature. To materialists, we have to ask, what do you mean when you say material? What do you mean when you say physical? If you look at the history of science, you'll see that the idea of what is physical has undergone very radical changes. Once upon a time, physical meant something like pebbles. Okay, very small pebbles, maybe even microscopic pebbles, but they're just chunks of stuff that bang around, and sometimes they stick to one another. This was the ancient theory of Democritus, of the Greeks, floating in the void, and when they interact with one another and connect to one another, they form combinations, and the combinations have different shapes and different sizes and different qualities, and that's all there is to it. But the idea of pebbles floating around in a void is desperately out of date. First of all, the void itself has its basic characteristics fixed by the observer. If you're going to talk about space, comma, and also about time, comma, your spatial judgments and your temporal judgments depend upon your inertial frame, where you are situated, and your state of motion vis-a-vis other people's inertial frames. So, according to contemporary science, neither space nor time is really objective, factual, only space-time, with a hyphen, or one word, is real. And then how space-time is structured has its own structure. According to general relativity, mass changes the structure of space-time. How space works, how time works, how space-time is, and the unit works. Gee, that wasn't part of the materialist view or the physicalist view that we had once upon a time. Worse than that, let's say in quantum mechanics, these little pebbles floating around in the void don't have the qualities that they have until we look. When we're not looking, they don't have them. For example, what's the position of one of these little pebbles? It doesn't have a position. It isn't anywhere until you measure it. When you measure it, you may get more or less information about where it is. Same thing with momentum, velocity, spin. These qualities come into existence when you measure them. When you're not measuring them, they aren't there. They're replaced by superpositions of probability and so forth and so on. They aren't there. Is that what you meant when you thought about pebbles 500 years ago? I don't think so. Stuff that has no concrete qualities until we take a look? That doesn't sound like what it is we were talking about in those times. Nor space-time. Nor relativity. And then, although a lot of scientists are allergic to it, there is the measurement problem. You have this probabilistic mathematics giving you information about where you might find things if you take a look. When you take a look, all that disappears and the thing, let's say, has a position. Now, how does that work? How come before you did the experiment, you had a bunch of probability, and when you do the experiment, the probability disappears, and you have a blip on a screen? Nobody knows how that works. Last time I checked, there were 8 different theories. One very popular theory, the Jihad Rimini theory, which does it in purely physical terms. Just recently, there have been experiments which more or less rule it out. One of the theories is that consciousness is what flips the coin and makes the thing concrete. Nobody understands consciousness. So the idea that you're a materialist, if you can't say what you mean by material, or you're going to be stuck in the same historical problem. Do you want to mean what they meant 500 years ago? We know that's wrong. You're going to take your position with what people will mean 500 years from now? You don't know what that is. Look at the changes that have taken place. So you end up with no concrete information on which to base your opposition to miracles. Noam Chomsky, who was no friend of ours, he was a great philosopher, of language in particular, and authored several revolutions, made a very sharp remark. I appreciate it as a philosopher. There is a whole study of what's called the mind-body problem. Is your mind just what your brain does, or isn't it? And if it isn't, how is it related? It's a giant problem that people are working on very hard for the last 80 years. And it's very controversial. People sort of guess that, well, you see, the reason it's very hard is because we really don't know what the mind is. It's hard to describe. It's hard to put into any reference that we're familiar with and we can measure. Chomsky said, I think the problem is hard because we don't know what a body is, let alone minds. If you take a look at the last 300 years of science and ask, what is a body, you get very different answers. If we can't decide in principle what counts as a body, how are we going to ever discuss reducing minds to bodies? We don't know what bodies are. That's an uphill battle. He was the only person I saw who ever made that remark. But I thought it was a very sharp remark. So someone who says, I'm a materialist and that's why I'm against miracles, owes what he can't possibly provide, and that is a non-controversial, acceptable definition of what counts as material. And if he can't do that, then his position doesn't really carry conviction. Second thing I want to talk about is simplicity. The claim will be that we have a picture of the world without miracles, and you have a picture of the world with miracles. Well, your picture is much more complicated. And it's a canon of science to choose the simpler theory. So that's why we are opposed to miracles, because you make the picture more complicated. There are at least 3 problems with this kind of remark. First of all, there are different kinds of simplicity. And often they compete with one another. One type, which goes back to Occam, people talk about Occam's razor, and that is your picture envisions the world made up of basic things, A, B, C, D, and E. His picture has A, B, C, D, and F. Oh, he's got an extra. Since he's got an extra, it's more complicated. It's less simple. So we're going to rule out his picture because it has more things in it. Well, actually, nobody would do that. They would add a qualification. And that is that adding in F doesn't change anything. It doesn't change the way the theory explains what's going on. It doesn't change the predictions that it has. It's something which, like a fifth wheel on a car, does no work. Everybody can agree that if you have a theory that explains things in this way and covers this ground, and you have another theory which explains the same things in the same way, covers the same ground, it's got an extra doohickey on the end, that you can prefer the first theory to the second, because the extra piece doesn't do any work. But almost never do you have a situation like that. When you compare theories and you just compare what kinds of things are there in the world, putting the extra stuff in the world does extra work. And the other theory says that extra work isn't worth doing. It's much more complicated. There's something in elementary physics, particle physics, called supersymmetry. Supersymmetry means every particle that we believe in, there's another partner particle, which doubles the number of particles, which we haven't seen. We haven't seen them. That's the theory that we're proposing. You say, why would you do that? Why would you double the number of particles? Because it makes it symmetrical. The rules have a symmetry. All the rules link together in a single type of formal picture how the world works. Put in extra stuff to make the structure simpler. So by complicating your ontology, complicating your picture of what there is, you simplify a picture of how it works. So one type of simplicity is working against another type of simplicity. How do you choose? Who says which type of simplicity is more important? Then there's conceptual simplicity. What basic concepts do you have to describe the world? Obviously, the fewer concepts you have, the simpler your theory is. That is to say, it has simpler conceptual basis. But maybe because it has a simpler conceptual basis, it needs more laws or a bigger ontology. How do you trade off one type of simplicity against another type of simplicity? Nobody knows. Not only that, but nobody knows that the three I just told you are the only types of simplicity. There may be other types as well. So just saying we'll go with the simplest theory is to ignore the fact that we don't have a good description of what counts as simplicity. But there's another problem. Let's suppose we did have a definition of the different types of simplicity, and let's suppose we did have a description of which ones count more and under what circumstances. But since it's very rare to have two theories that do all the same work in exactly the same way, and one has an extra doohickey, you're going to be confronted with theories which do some things well and some things less well. The other one covers more ground. They're going to be more subtle, less well-defined comparisons to make. And in this regard, I want to point something out to you, which I haven't seen discussed, but I think is very important. Let's think of the history of successful theories. Are the simpler ones the ones that are more successful historically? Gee, I don't think so. You know, Newton's physics is much simpler than contemporary physics, much simpler. But Newton turns out to be wrong. Wrong, capital W. Not wrong, right when not going too fast or things that are not too small, but then wrong. No, it's just wrong. The predictions it makes are false. Sometimes the falsity of the prediction is very minute and it'll be hard to measure, but in fact, it's wrong all the way down the line. They tell you differently. I'm speaking as the philosopher of science. They're wrong. So Newton's theory was considerably simpler than what we have. What history taught us is we need to complicate it. We need to complicate it. Because doing it simply just isn't going to work. How about everything goes around the world? That's obvious. Open your eyes and take a look. You see it every day and every night. Everything revolves around us. That's a very simple picture. Nobody believes that again today, right? The picture we have is much more complex. A universe with galaxies and clusters of galaxies and great expanses which nobody can explain because they're not equal to everything else. What happened to simplicity? It turned out not to be true. The cell was thought to be just a liquid contained with a membrane in it, which is necessary for doing what you need to do in the body. No one dreamt that there are thousands of molecular machines in each cell, turning out products millions per minute, coordinated with one another. No one dreamt of that. DNA, which if you stretch it out as a molecule, it would go 6 feet wide, 6 feet long. It's all curled up into a microscopic ball. Well, the simple picture of the cell just is wrong. Somehow, simplicity didn't work there. So, if you think of the track record of simplicity, it doesn't seem to be doing too well. If experience teaches us anything, it's teaching us that the world is much more complicated than we thought. Things are more interrelated and connected than we thought. Consequences are much more elaborate than we thought. And this includes lots of things that we don't understand. I don't know what the current understanding of chlorofluorocarbons is, which is supposed to be destroying the ozone layer. But when they first discovered it, it was reported by the enthusiastic press that these chlorofluorocarbons in your spray bottles all migrates to the South Pole. That's where it punches a hole in the ozone. Why does it go south? Why not north? Why not spread around equally, Go to Ukraine and bother the Russians. I don't know. Why does it do that? Well, we did some experiments, and we see it there. That's where it goes. So I think that the lesson that we're getting is that the world really isn't simple. When they started to work on atomic theory in the 1910s and 20s, at the very beginning, there were exactly two particles, a proton and an electron. Proton sat in the nucleus, the electron rotated the nucleus. That's when they said, you see, the atoms are like little solar systems. And you still have the picture of the path of the thing going around. Of course, going to quantum mechanics, that's absolute nonsense. But all right. But no, it isn't just protons and electrons. First of all but one of the nuclei have neutrons, because they're not electrically charged. It was hard to detect them, but they detect them in terms of their mass later. And then there are the gluons that are being exchanged, and the mesons, and the cosmic rays that have other particles which are free and don't fit into any classification. Some say that there are 32 basic particles, and then with a supersymmetry it would be 64 particles. And some say the higher the energy we use in our experiments, more new particles we find. Maybe there's an infinity of particles. What is a particle? A particle is a certain way that an amount of energy behaves. Maybe if you have enough energy, new particles will come into existence because they contain that higher level of energy. Everybody talks about the Big Bang as the borderline, because that had the highest possible temperatures. Maybe it is the highest possible physical temperatures, but some theories could predict for you, if you went higher, you'd get other things that you didn't have. So what if our universe can't produce any higher temperatures? So the idea of two particles, when with that you could explain all of the physical world. Talk about a simplicity. That's a gigantic simplification, but it turned out not to be correct. If somebody tells you that our theory is simpler because you have miracles and we don't, say, thanks, have a nice lunch. Don't bother me. That's not a sufficient reason to oppose miracles. Then there's the idea of progress. Here, I think the situation is just a bit more subtle. Scientists start by assuming the world is physical. And they've been working on it for hundreds of years, and they're making progress. They're really making progress. Experiments we have predicted outcomes for experiments. We predicted observations. The predictions become much more accurate over time. Maybe 500 years ago, you could predict there'll be an eclipse next month. Today, you can predict up to the second when it will start. So, since all this progress is being made, and it's all being made on the basis of an assumption that the world is physical, doesn't that mean that the assumption the world is physical is, number one, very fruitful? And since we are making progress, we should look forward to more progress. There's still no reason to think that progress is going to stop tomorrow. And that being the case, if you have something which can't be explained in physical terms today, it's quite reasonable to assume that eventually it will be explained in physical terms because science is covering more and more ground. I don't think that argument works. You won't be surprised to hear that. Look at the hat that I'm wearing. I don't think it works because I think there are two important limitations. There are places where science is not making progress, and perhaps even worse, There are places where science is going backwards. It's regressing, not progressing. They don't tell you that story because they want you to think of it as a kind of monotone increasing graph, something that's only going up. By the way, just to vote by guilt by association, that was exactly the communist picture of history. You know, the iron law of history going from feudalism to capitalism to communism, it's going to go, it has to go. Lessen the birth pangs of history by making the transition quicker and easier instead of fighting against it, which is going to be definitely a losing battle. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at the things which, let's say, 100 years ago or 200 years ago were very simple and became more complicated. One of them is the nature of how the world works. Up until 1965, from ancient times, the world was thought to have no beginning and no end. There are laws that govern how it behaves. They're always the same. The world is always the same. That's a very simple picture. The heavens are always the same. The stars and the sun and the moon always appear the same for thousands of years. In the West, anyway, there are no recorded exceptions to that rule. And the laws of nature are necessary. They couldn't be any other than they are. Every chicken comes from an egg. Every egg comes from a chicken. Infinitely. And in the future, there'll be eggs and chickens forever. That's a very simple picture. Big Bang isn't a simple picture at all. The whole of existence had an origin. You go back in time, you come to an end of it. There's no further back to go. There's no time before that. That's not a simple picture. That picture raises terrible mysteries. It just turned out that the simple picture isn't true. And the reason they say it isn't true is because the simple picture made a specific prediction. If you measure the temperature of intergalactic space, you should get almost no heat whatsoever. And the Big Bang theory made a prediction that if you measure the intergalactic space, you should find a background radiation of about 3 degrees Kelvin. And they found the heat. So the gold standard in science is make a prediction and see if it comes true. Well, the prediction made by the steady state theory, the idea that the world is always the same, always has been, always will be, made a prediction that came out false. And the Big Bang theory made a prediction that came out true. That's why the vast majority of thinkers in this field went over to the Big Bang theory in 1965. Well, it's not a simple picture. I told you about the cell. The picture of the cell was supposed to be very simple. It's not difficult at all. And the cell turned out to be fantastically complicated. The fossil record, according to evolution, there ought to be what are called the missing links. Darwin's theory predicts gradual change. And that's not just, how shall I say, an arbitrary thought. If you're taking a living organisms are very complicated, and a lot of the complications in them interlock with one another. So if you make a fairly large change to one, the others are going to break down, and it's not going to have babies. And if it doesn't have babies, its genes are going to be lost. You know, they talk about the giraffe. The giraffe grows a great long neck, so it can eat from the top of the trees. That's false also, but just pretend that was true, okay? But what about the fact that its heart can't pump blood to its brain? Well, that long neck isn't going to help. If its brain doesn't get blood, it's just going to drop dead, that's all. Okay, strengthen the heart so it pumps blood up. What about balance? The balance organs are in the head. The head is now separated from the body by 10 feet. Are they going to work? No, they're not. They got to be changed. And then you're pumping blood up this long tube to get to the head. When the part rests, why doesn't the blood go sloshing back down from gravity? So they have to evolve certain types of barriers which, when the heart stops pumping, they cut in to hold the stuff back so it doesn't slosh back down. You need a lot of different changes to happen in a coordinated way. If you change the heart and don't change the rest, it's just going to die. Okay, so it means small changes. A small change to the heart, a small change to the balance, a small change to the neck, and so on and so on. Fine. So then the fossil record ought to have in it a record of all these changes. And it doesn't. So Darwin knew this, and he writes about it. In many things, Darwin was a clear and fair thinker. He did make some mistakes, but he said, if anyone trusts the fossil record, he should reject my theory. Because the fossil record in 1869 didn't have the missing links that were needed. But he said, I think my theory is still true because I can explain to you why they're missing. First of all, we haven't dug up enough fossils. If we dig for another 100 years, we'll find lots and lots more. We'll fill in a lot of the empty spaces. And in addition, some creatures exist in times where fossilization is retarded because it's too aquatic or too acidic. I don't know exactly the chemical signature, but sometimes fossils don't form in the same abundance. And that being the case, we don't expect it. So I'm not surprised, Darwin said in 1869, that the fossil record does not today support my theory. But by 1969, it was getting desperate. Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard and Niles Eldridge of the Natural History Museum in New York concocted a theory called punctuated equilibria, where they said it can't be filled in now on the grounds that we'll find more fossils. We've found lots and lots of fossils, and we have a complete record of fossils with holes in it, holes where the changes are not gradual. And we know more about when fossils form, and if they were really there, they should have formed. So we need to have another type of explanation. Now, this explanation went through 3.1 and 3.2 and 3.3 and 4.1. But the original explanation was this. If you have a small isolated population, then changes can take place very rapidly in several 100,000 years. If you have a big, large connected population, the change is going to be washed out. When you're doing your excavations, what are you going to find? The 500 mile by 500 mile connected plains of millions of individuals, or the 6 mile by 6 mile valley where 500 individuals live? You're not going to find the valley. You're going to find the plains. On the plains, you don't see the changes. The changes take place in the valley. So you have this species, some of which end up in the valley, the rest of which are on the plains. The ones in the valley are changing rapidly. The ones on the plains are staying the same. Then something happens. The ones in the valley come back onto the plains, the new improved versions with sharper hooves and sharper eyesight and better, longer horns and better coordination. And they outcompete the ones on the plains and replace them. We're digging down. When you dig down in the plains, you first find the new improved ones, and then you find the old ones without the in-betweens. Because in-betweens are stuck in that valley where you didn't find them. Okay. So what is this? You don't have the evidence you need to support the theory. The evidence you need is a smooth paleontological record, a smooth fossil record. You now tell me a story which explains why you don't have the evidence. Isn't that a little suspicious? Isn't science supposed to proceed by providing evidence, not explaining why you don't have evidence? Why should I believe you're right if all you can do is explain to me why you don't have the evidence? In particular, I would need some very strong observations to convince me that your theory is true. Now, Gould understood that in his magnum opus, The Structures of Evolutionary Theory, 1,400 pages, which I read. He says, I realize that for you, the reader, this is just a made-up story. There's no reason for you to accept it. So I have to provide you, and he says, I think on the basis of checking how genes dovetail with one another and how they overlap in time, you could create a criterion which would reflect my theory of how it developed as against other possibilities. And he tries to work it out there. At least he's honest enough. But now, What would have been simple? What it would have been simple is a fossil record that gives you all the fossils you need. Well, turns out not to be true. And if, in fact, like some people urge, that the fossil record is right, then Darwin's theory is incorrect. That means Darwin's theory, which is reasonably simple, isn't correct. Other things are playing a role in the way in which life develops, and the truth is more complicated than what you are presenting to us. You get used to this over time, that over and over again, the simpler theory turns out to be invalid. It doesn't really account for the phenomena that you're dealing with, and you have to complicate the theory to make it deal with the phenomena. It's a loose argument, but the feeling is maybe simplicity isn't a good bet. It doesn't seem to be working well. The really simple theories turn out not to be correct. Yeah.
How do you explain the steps with the missing gaps? How do you explain that there are steps?
Has he explained it with the theory that they can concoct is called punctuated equilibria. That is to say, when you look in the fossil record, you find equilibrium. Things are the same. All of a sudden, a big jump to the new thing. How does it work? It works like this. You have two geographies. You have the plains, 500 miles by 500 miles, millions of individuals, wildebeest, running around and eating the grass and goring each other and doing the things that wildebeest do. Okay? Now, 500 of these wildebeest, males and females, somehow get isolated in a valley. They're stuck there. There's only enough food in the valley to support 500. The population is not going to expand. With a very small population, changes can take place very quickly.
I understand that, but there's gaps.
Right? Yes.
But there are interval steps. Why does there have to be some sort of evolution to the end creature?
I mean, it doesn't have to be. I'm discussing a theory that says there is. Now, the question is what they predict and whether they're correct or incorrect. I'm not saying there has to be. I don't believe in the whole thing.
There are some fossils that are found that are different than the animals.
Yeah. Okay. Now, this, as Ernst Mayr pointed out, the word evolution has at least 5 different meanings. Finding different fossils just tells you things haven't always been the same. Things have changed. I think everybody who's party to the discussion agrees on that. That's not controversial. That's not where the wars are fought, that things change or don't change. The question is, why do they change? What makes them change? What's the engine, the force, the activity that makes the changes happen? Just finding different fossils doesn't answer that question. That just says that there are different ones. It doesn't say why there are different ones. Darwin had a way of explaining why they're different, how they got to be different. That explanation implies that it has to be smooth changes, very small changes. And if the way in which it's done is very small changes, then in the fossil record you ought to find very small changes, and you don't find them. That's his problem. As I said, he knew it was a problem. The answer is, they really do take place in a place where you're not going to find them. Okay, maybe no, maybe yes, or maybe no. But if the business of science is to convince me on the basis of evidence, instead of giving me the evidence, you explain to me why you can't have evidence. It's sort of like saying, look, he's a murderer. He committed the murder. So where's the gun? Where's the witnesses and so on and so on? You understand? He's high up in the mafia, right? He's got a lot of control, a lot of influence. That's why there's no gun and no witnesses, because they're all afraid of him. Will he go to jail? I don't think so. You got to produce the gun and produce the witnesses. You got to produce evidence. Not enough to explain why you don't have evidence. Like you can't convict a person on those grounds. The same thing ought to be true in science. You got to produce the evidence. Don't explain to me why you can't have evidence. Okay, so now, when you look at the history of simple theories, there was a valiant attempt in the last 50 years to say that consciousness is just something that the brain does. As John Searle, who's a very good philosopher, says, your stomach, digestion is what your stomach does, thinking is what your brain does. And although he made a successful effort at explaining what he means, but he never faced the objections to the theory. And there are legion of objections, and I've spoken about this, and it's recorded. in various places. So if you're not going to be content, which I definitely think you shouldn't be content. And by the way, there are great philosophers who reject this picture that the brain, that thinking is in the brain. David Chalmers and Thomas Nagel are two of the greatest. A book came out from Oxford about 4 years ago called The Waning of Materialism, how materialism is losing traction, it's losing favor. 29 noted, good philosophers, all writing against materialism. So somebody thinks it's open and shut, and we're Don Quixote tilting at windmills because we don't know what's going on in the modern world. You don't know what's going on in the modern world. You think that materialism has it all locked in. You're wrong. There's a very healthy debate about materialism. In particular, so now if you have to acknowledge that there's something which is the mind, which isn't the brain, and they have to decide how it's related one to another, the picture is much more complicated. I think we're getting a repeated message from nature that your attempts to explain nature in simple terms just aren't working. That's not an impossibility proof. It doesn't mean that maybe someday, tomorrow someone will come up with something that does the whole job and so forth and so on. But the trend over the last couple of 100 years is that simplicity certainly isn't the keystone for truth. You can't simply say, my theory is simpler than yours, therefore my theory is better than yours. That you can't say. That's certainly not justified. So if somebody wants to say that he's against miracles because his picture is simpler, that's not going to work. Also, as I just gave the examples, when someone says that science is progressing, it leaves out the places where the regression takes place, where things that were thought once upon a time to be simple turn out not to be simple. So they're losing traction. That's not progress, that's regress. They don't tell you about that. To have a balanced sense of what science is doing, one ought to take account of the progress and regress and try to measure or isolate the areas in which the progress and regress take place. And then that will help you make up your mind where you can trust it and where you can't trust it. Deep theory, the deepest theories that explain how the world works, that's an area where there's wholesale dismissal. The old theories are simply dismissed, and new theories replace them. Today, the controversy is so deep, controversy between quantum gravity and string theory, that the opponents of string theory say, listen to this beautiful expression, it's not even wrong. It's not even wrong. Because it isn't a candidate. Because it doesn't say anything. That's a pretty stringent critique. So from a picture of the world, its basic laws and how it develops, like Newton, you now have a situation where they can't even agree whether something's a candidate for being a law. That's not progress, that's regress. Now, also, this is the last remark that I want to make. Time's it? Yeah. The fields in which progress is being made are narrow. Experimental science on non-living materials. Certain types of technology, not biotechnology obviously, but certain types of technology are making tremendous strides. But understanding biological organisms, particularly understanding the body, which is phenomenally complicated. Remember vestigial organs, things left over from previous stages of evolution, and when the evolution, which is a blind process, made changes, these things were carried along for no purpose. Well, they haven't had a very happy history in the last 40 years. A lot of them have been discovered to be functional. Same with junk DNA is discovered to be functional. So the picture that these things are just hangers-on turns out to be false. They have complex interactions with the rest of the body, which now have to be calculated. Just one, the appendix. So first of all, it was just extra. Then they noticed that bacteria are stored there. So they thought, well, maybe when there's some kind of disease that flushes bacteria out of the digestive stream, new bacteria can come from there and replace the good bacteria that you have in your body so that you can recover more quickly. Maybe. And that's a reasonable thing to do. But you know what they never did? They never took a population of people with appendices, and a population of people without appendices and check their health records to see whether it makes any difference. Turns out it does make a difference. So recoveries from certain type of surgery, if you have an appendix, it goes better. But because they were convinced by evolution that it must be vestigial, they didn't even ask the question. They didn't even make the investigation. When I was a kid, I had my tonsils out, as many, many others did. While they were in there, they took the adenoids out, because clearly the adenoids don't do anything. Yeah, that translates into we didn't see them doing anything. The gap? Well, if I don't see it, then it isn't there, because I know everything. And they took them out because sometimes they get infected. So while we're in there anyway with general anesthesia, why not take them out? They don't do that anymore, because they do have a function. And nobody knows whether that's the only function. So again, the picture of these things do nothing and therefore I don't have to investigate them, which is a very simple picture, is giving way to a picture where they do something and they have function. Same with junk DNA. So-called junk DNA, supposedly only 4% of your DNA is active. 96% is junk. Nobody thought that was even absurd. Now they discovered for vast tracts of it that it has function. It just doesn't code for proteins. But that's not the only thing that DNA does. It doesn't just code for proteins. You can look it up. Look up junk DNA on the net. You'll get a whole long list of functions. So things are getting more complicated. Not less in many areas, and certainly in the human sciences. We can read Greek tragedies today, and they ring with us. The dilemmas they faced, the struggles that they had. Do we have superior understanding of how human beings work and what their basic psychology is and what the rules of right action are and so forth and so on? I don't see any progress there at all. Indeed, with the kinds of things that people have convinced themselves of, contemporary world, there's tremendous regress. Fantasies of magic power to decide what you are. To decide what you are. I'll just end with a joke. I read an account of a movie about blue-skinned aliens, a science fiction movie. And a critic said, notice that almost all the actors are white. That's cultural appropriation. Just cultural appropriation? The culture doesn't exist, right? We want the blue-skinned aliens that they should act in the movie because it's about blue-skinned aliens? Okay, that was one stupid thing she said. But worse than that, one of the commenters said, maybe those actors identify as blue-skinned aliens. You can't tell them they're not blue-skinned aliens. They are blue-skinned aliens, so they identify that way. This is progress, boys and girls. This is progress. We understand better now. We understand the world better now. I don't think so.